Okay, good evening, everybody. And my name's Carla Boswell from the Parks Trust in Milton Keynes. And I am here to host, in partnership with the Butterfly Conservation, this fourth series of training events this year. And I will hand you over to Nick Bowles, who's going to be presenting this evening. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Carla. Can I ask people, please, to make sure that you're muted? And actually, because you don't really need your camera on, could you switch off your video feed? Because I noticed that it looked like we had a relatively poor connection there, and it's slightly easier for the connection to be stable if fewer people are broadcasting a video. Thank you. All right, so as Carla said, we're going to be recording this. And the way that you might ask questions, because I'm assuming that some people will want to ask questions, is that you should put them into the chat, please. And you might be able to see on your screens that Jim Asher, near the top of the screen, I would expect. If you want to say hello, Jim, and you'll definitely appear for people then.
I'll say hello, Jim, in that case.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, it's a bit of the two Ronnies. So Jim's going to be reading the chat and interrupting me with your questions if it seems pertinent to the point that I'm addressing at that time. And we'll also have time for questions later. In fact, I shall stop at various stages because I do need to warn you, dear listener, this is going to be information dense. So with the density that I bring to it and the density of the information, it's going to be a very heavy evening. So I'm hoping that everyone's feeling refreshed and lively, and we'll make a start. Do I need to say anything else? No, I think I've said it all. You're going to put your questions in chat, please, and we'll kick off. So let's just close that window. There we are. So we're talking about recording butterflies and moths with standardized surveys. And I've been asked a few times during the week, what's the difference between tonight and last week? Well, last week we were looking at different ways to record sightings when you're just doing what you might call casual recording. So in your garden or on a walk, nothing as part of a standardized survey. And we're going to look at what makes the surveys we're talking about tonight standardized as the beginning of our talk. And we're going to talk about two different but very similar types of survey. One is called a transect survey, also sometimes known as a pollard walk, and the other is called the wider countryside butterfly survey. So those two at the top here, look, transect survey and wider countryside butterfly survey. Most of what we're doing at the beginning of the evening refers to them, and we're going to move on after a little bit of a pause for your brains to recover and cool down to talk about reduced effort and 10 kilometer square recording, which have some similarities, but not much with Transect WCBS, but they are slightly different to other sorts of recording. Okay. So if we're going to do a transect walk, what do we need? Well, you'll need to be on a transect site, a site which has a transect upon it. You can set these up any way you like, but generally speaking, you wouldn't normally just do that. You'd normally join in with a transect that already exists, and you'd be on a transect site, and you would have with you, I think, a pen probably, so that you can write things down onto a recording sheet. We'll look at a recording sheet later. I'll show you what they look like. Or you could, if you're a rebel, use a notebook instead of a recording sheet. It's frowned upon, but it can be more sensible in some cases. Or if you're really rebellious, you might use your smart device and just stick everything in there. You could just do a voice recording, or you could, if you prefer, open a Word document in your smart device or some other type of documentation device app and stick it all down in there. As long as you keep very clear notes about exactly which section of the transect you're on and what you see, then that's going to work. You're going to need a thermometer with you.
Nick, I have had a question come in to check, will these slides be shared later?
Well, I'm afraid that all depends whether the recording works, but if it does, yes, that's the plan. The other talks in this series have all been recorded, as this one is being, and they have all been shared on the Upper Thames branch website. So The plan is yes, but we need to get to the end of it and make sure the recording has worked successfully before we can be absolutely certain. So that's the intention.
Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, a thermometer. Sorry, Jim.
I'm just saying thank you,
Is that
Nick.
it, Jim? Oh, okay. Oh, don't do that. We haven't got time for thank yous. No time for courtesy. So you're going to need a thermometer. Now, you might have one in your car, and that's absolutely fine, provided you're aware that what you're checking is the shade temperature. So if your car is parked in the sun, or if you read the thermometer in the car as you drive to the site to do the transect, it won't be giving you a shade temperature. I say this without knowing your car, but if you're driving along a road, which like most roads in the UK, it's black and it's in the sun because you wouldn't be going to do your transect if the weather was rubbish, that road surface will have heated up and the air directly above it will actually be slightly warmer than if, and I don't suppose many of you will try this to check whether I'm right, but if you drive your car across a grassy field instead of along the road, you'll find that there is an immediate dip in the temperature because above the grass, it is cooler. So you need to make an allowance. You need to check. My own car is just under 1 degree higher when I'm driving along a road than the actual shade temperature. If I'm driving along in complete shade, if I'm in a really thick wood or if it's a cloudy day, then my car reads correctly. But if I'm out in the sun, which I often am because most roads are fairly open, then my thermometer's a bit high. So just be aware of that. You need to meet a certain standard minimum temperature to do a transect. So as you drive towards the site, you might be checking the temperature on your car's thermometer, and you need to know that you need to check in advance whether that's accurate. You're going to need some clothing suitable to the task. You might be walking through some prickly stuff. You might need sun cream if you've got delicate skin or even normal skin and you don't want to get cancer. And optionally, you might want to take with you a clipboard, camera. You can't actually use the camera while you're on transect, but I'll come back to that. The guidance notes, which are available to you in case you need to check any other finer points. If you haven't taken a smart device to do the recording and the GPS and so on, you might want a phone with you because sometimes people do fall over, unfortunately, and need to call someone to say, can you come and fetch me? I've hurt my ankle. A plastic bag because just who knows, you might want to take a piece of a plant, something, take it home and see what it is. A net if the use is agreed, and maybe a drink, some food. And if you're new to the site, I think you're going to need an OS map so that you can work out precisely where you are. If you've got a smart device, you could argue, well, I'm going to use my smart device. Fair enough. But if you've taken a notebook and a pen and not a smart device, you might want a map. Now, I thought this was a good way to reinforce what we've just said. So my choice, if I was going out surveying like these three bright young folks here, I'd be taking a smart device. I find it easier to get everything in there than to write it all down with a pen, but it depends, as individuals differ, except in the middle of summer when I see so much that using a pen and paper is actually easier and using a tally system. If you're using a pen and paper, I think you might need a map at least on the first time that you visit a site to make sure you are actually walking the sections excuse me, exactly as they should be walked. And I would say, provided that you are allowed by the bylaws of the site you're walking on, you want to take a net. Now, I know that some people are going to say, no, don't take a net. That's not a very nice thing to do. It isn't a good thing to do because it could harm the insects. Agreed, but we do want to know really accurately what they are. And some insects can't be told apart when they fly past you. You have to either find them stopped, and you haven't got time to wait when you're on a transect, or you need to net them. I'll come back to that in a minute. I think you need a thermometer, as I said. Now, you can use the one in the car, or you could decide that you'll take one with you that you can place somewhere about 1 meter above the ground in the shade and read it to make sure it's at least 13 when you start, and you have to record it at the end of the walk as well. If you're like me, you're going to need a pair of specs because I can't see what I'm writing, and I can't see my phone screen properly without a pair of specs. And you might want something like a peaked hat so that when you're looking into the sun, you can still see what's in front of you. I don't mean trees, but butterflies are easier to spot with a peaked hat to keep the sun out of your eyes. So that's pretty much all you need. And you really don't want to be carrying a great deal of other stuff. There really isn't any point taking great big guidebooks with you. None at all. You haven't got time to look at them. So avoid carrying too much. It might make you feel really strong and it might impress people, but it won't help you do a good transect. So how do we walk the transect? We've got all the stuff in a bag. We've got to the beginning of the site. We've come to the point which either on a map or our phone's GPS, or because someone has shown us where to go, we know this is the point at which the transects start. Most transects will have been broken into sections with clearly defined points at which you end one section and start the next. A section doesn't need to end exactly where the next one starts, but the end of one section and the beginning of the next section do need to be very clear so that everyone is recording from the beginning and end at the same points. And you will notice that transects have to be walked at certain times of the year. So a transect route is normally walked once each week or every week from the 1st of April right through till the 30th of September. And as it says at the bottom there, no doubt you're reading ahead of me, a fixed width band, typically 5 meters. Now, usually people look at it like this. That's supposed to be a person inside an imaginary box in the countryside. And please don't moan about my little picture not being very good. It's the best I could manage. So I'm afraid that's all you're going to get. So you're supposed to walk along counting every butterfly that flies through this imaginary box. And you might be on a path with a fairly wide margin either side of you. So it might be the middle of a grassy field, but it could be a woodland with a wide ride. And you only count 5 meters across, 5 meters above, and 5 meters ahead, because any distance greater than that, and it is almost impossible to identify the smallest butterflies. It's not so hard with things like swallowtail, which we won't see around here anyway, but it's very, very difficult with small butterflies at greater distances. Now, I've put this person equidistant from either the left or the right-hand side of their walking route. That doesn't have to be the case. If, for instance, you're walking in a woodland and the angle of the sun is such that one side of the ride is sunny and the other side of the ride is in shade, it makes sense to walk so that you've got 5 meters of the sunny side. You could walk down the middle of that sunny side and do 2.5 either side, or you could just walk down the middle of the ride and do the 5 meters of this very wide ride, which is on the side in the sun, and ignore the bit which is in the shade. So it's the distance that's important. 5 meters above, 5 meters in front, and 5 meters across. Doesn't matter where you position yourself within that box, but that's the bit you record. Here we've got someone with a pole that I took along when I was doing training back in the days when we could do these sorts of things. I really think this is a worthwhile exercise. If you've never tried this before, if you've never tried to estimate how far is 2.5 meters from me, find yourself a pole. You can get them in garden centres quite easily. It's about the standard length of a bamboo cane. In fact, they're 2.4 meters bamboo canes. That's the longest size that comes easily to hand, but that's good enough. And then walk along and try and judge when you are 2.4 meters, that's how long your bamboo cane is, and then just measure it out with the stick. You'll be surprised, I think. Most people think that 2.4 meters is quite a bit further from them than it actually is. And it's worth doing this because you do need to be sure that when you walk your transect and record your 2.5 meters either side, you're doing exactly the same as everyone else around the country walking transects. because we can't have it obviously that some people do 7 meters and other people do 2 meters. That would be daft. So it's about being cautious about judging the distance, and using a stick just to get used to how far that is a good way of training yourself. Now, as I said, between the 1st and 30th of September, you can go out and walk your transect after 10:45 a.m. most of the time, and before 3:45 p.m. most of the time. But notice you can go a little earlier and quite a lot later in perfect weather conditions. So if it's one of those blistering hot summer's days, it might actually be better not to go at midday when things go into the shade and just sit very still, but to go a bit later. And it says, as you can see, when weather conditions are suitable. And that's what we're coming on to next. So it's been discovered through a lot of trial and error that this means, provided you've got at least 60% sun, and that, by the way, is not whether it's slightly hazy, that's the amount of time that the sun is shining. So if it takes you 10 minutes to walk a section of your transect, the sun should have been shining for at least 6 of those 10 minutes. That's what 60% sun means, the amount of time the sun is shining. And assuming that when you set off it was 13 degrees C or warmer, off you go. So next week, I think there are some days when it's forecast to be above 13 degrees C. And next week, we do have the 1st of April in that week. So next week you could go out, and assuming you've got your 60% sun, which I'm afraid might be the issue next week, we might not get that, you could walk a transect. When we get a bit further into the year and the temperature when you set off is above 17, the transect can be walked even if it's 100% cloudy. Notice it says provided it isn't raining. Now, I find personally that at 17 degrees in 100% cloud, you see less. And that's why it's important to make sure you record this accurately. The software behind all the data collection is able to work out what's going on, and it can take account of weather and temperature. We'll come back to that later, but it does a job of working out for you what you might have seen in better weather conditions when the weather is poor. And then right at the bottom, all this stuff about 60% sun, at least 13 degrees C, and then it says, except that if the wind speed is above 5. Now, a lot of people aren't quite sure what a force 5 Beaufort scale wind is. So let's have a quick look at this chart here. We're going down to 5, which is here, look, a strong breeze, flag snaps, large branches in motions. You can hear whistling in wires. So if you're walking underneath telephone wires and they're whistling, that's time to say, oh, probably I shouldn't be doing this. Above all this way from 0, which is obviously when there's no detectable wind, right the way down to 4, which is quite, as it says, quite a fresh breeze. It's perfectly okay to walk, provided it's above 30 and you've got your minimum 60% sun. Or if it's hotter, a bit more cloud than that. So we've got flags rippling, leafy trees beginning to sway. So it's, that's quite a strong wind. But force 5, depending on how open your sight is, you might need to think about coming back a different day. And definitely by the time we get to 6, remember this scale goes up to 12, so this isn't, I haven't stopped here because this is the strongest wind. I've stopped here because 5 is the ultimate. You might get away with a 5 if you're in a wood, but I wouldn't on an open hillside. Now, I noticed that there's a birding blog called No Such Thing as Bad Birding Weather, and there's lots of pictures of people suffering, but we don't have to do that. Butterfly people are far more sensible. I hope all the people who like birds are not now switching off, sorry. But we only go out when the weather's lovely, or at least that's when we go out. Sometimes it gets a bit nasty while you're out there, but we don't do butterfly surveys in bad weather. It's got to be good weather. I'm going to deal with some of the other things which usually come up as questions. So walking a transect means maintaining the same steady pace. I've put throughout each section, but I think I should say throughout the season. You need to remember when you start gambling around your site in April and all the way round on an hour's walk, you see one brimstone a bit in the distance, too far to count, and one peacock close enough to you that you can count it because you scare it up off the path as you walk. It seems easy to go quite fast around your transect, but in the summer, when you're trying to work out small white from green veined white, large white from female brimstone, when you're trying to work out all those little golden skippers, ringlet from meadow brown, possibly some of the other species like the blues, common blue female and brown argus, you've got to go slow. And just literally counting everything takes longer. So you need to walk far more slowly than seems necessary in the spring to maintain the same steady pace in every section all season long. And in the next bit, most transects in our area are walked by a small team, actually, not by an individual person, which means that one person will walk 1 week and then maybe 3 weeks later they go again. 2 other people walk the weeks in between. But it is best, without any doubt, I'm afraid, despite the fact some people don't like this, it is best that one person is recording their own sightings. So if somebody else walks with you, fair enough, but they should keep quiet and they shouldn't keep coughing every time you miss something, because that's what one person does. One person will miss some sightings. And if somebody else is with you and they keep telling you what you've missed, that will give you an unreasonably high score. So best to be one person doing all the recording. And another thing you're supposed to do, but a lot of people tell me they don't think this is feasible, is you shouldn't stop once you start a section. You should walk the entire section at your steady pace, only stopping to write down what you've seen on that section when you get to the end. Now, as I said, if you walk your hour in the first week of April and all you see on the way is one peacock, that isn't too tricky. But in the summer, when you're going to see hundreds of butterflies along a section, obviously this becomes really difficult. So this is something which I think you hold as an aim and you realize it may not be possible. At the peak of the summer, this might not be possible, but do as much as you can to keep moving, because otherwise butterflies will fly from behind you, ones that you've just counted. They will go past you while you are stopped and writing down what you're looking at, and then you'll find them again about 10 meters further down the track and think they're new butterflies. So you're going to hopefully get to the end of the section, write down what you've seen, and you'll notice I've put it here because it is really important and people often forget this. Where's my mouse gone? There it is. The percentage of time that the sun was shining. Now, on some of the official recording sheets, that's right at the bottom of the page and people miss it. On some of the recording sheets, and I don't know why, but some recording sheets have it at the top of the page. So there are 2 different versions of this particular recording sheet that we will see in a minute. And some of them have the sun shining time at the bottom. Watch out for that. Don't think you don't need to record it. It is crucial that you do. How do you know if the sun is shining? Well, here's a clue. If you can see a shadow, even if it's a very hazy shadow, the sun is shining. So when you're walking along in your section, in addition to counting all those butterflies and possibly some day flying moths and maybe the odd dragonfly, you're also looking constantly to see if you've got a shadow. It's not something you need to get your watch out and time. It's not quite that precise, but you need to see if you've got a shadow. As soon as you can't see the shadow of your foot above the ground, then it's time to call it cloudy. And you need to have a feel for how much of your section you had no shadow. And by the way, just to throw in, if you're walking under trees and you're in the shade of trees, but the sun is out, That's 100% sun. The shade of trees does not count as cloudy. So in a wood, whether the sun is out somewhere above the trees is what you're interested in, and not whether you're walking through shade. This is very important as well. I'm sorry, there's quite a lot of very important things. Never count a butterfly that you can't identify with 100% certainty. It is far better to let it go past, because if it was just one butterfly on the entire transect, then it probably isn't making a big difference to the population of whatever that species is. If you see something and you're not sure, you don't put it down. And although people find this bonkers, you never count a butterfly that flies from behind you. And that includes the only purple emperor that you see all summer that flies from behind you, settles in front of you, and then flies off again. And I've heard the argument repeatedly, but I only saw one purple emperor the entire walk. It must be a purple emperor. I've got to record it. No, not if it flies from behind you. Because remember, you're not doing your transect as some sort of competition to win I saw the most butterflies in the UK. We're doing it to get a standardized set of results comparable with everybody else's in the UK. And they're not counting the butterflies that come from behind them. And so you shouldn't be either. I've put here that you shouldn't write down a butterfly if you know you already saw it. So sometimes you will actually see a butterfly, one of the more obvious species, fly past you from behind after you just saw it. And if you see it go ahead of you and settle, then we'll just discount it. Don't write it down again. Difficult species. This is things like some of the whites, perhaps, if there's clouds of them, and definitely the small and the Essex skipper. What's entirely possible and suggested in the guidance is that when you get to the end of a section, you can stop, you can wander back, look at some of the butterflies you just walked past in your section, and work out what sort of percentages there were of the difficult species. I wouldn't spend a long time on this, but it's a good way to get a feel for it. And this is when your net might come in handy, because you could catch a few of those golden skippers and have a quick look before you release them again to work out whether they were all small, all Essex, or a percentage of each. So at this point, I'm going to pause because people may well have questions, especially those who've walked transects in the past. If we give people...
There was one question from Duncan to
right.
say, if you have a week of poor weather, is it better to miss that week or to do a survey in substandard conditions?
I'm coming to it, Jim, but I'll answer it now as well by saying it depends. So if you know from the fact that you walked the transect last week when it was fine, and the weather forecast suggests that in a fortnight it's going to be back to being fine, it's just one solitary week of bad weather, don't do it. But in this country, and in my opinion, very often in May, we get 3 weeks of continuous easterly winds with a sort of a very low cloud, temperatures of about 12 degrees C. And if you miss 3 weeks, that's a problem. But we will see this in a minute when we come on to it. Have any more questions popped up, Jim?
Yeah, 2 more. One to ask.
Good, I thought they might.
Yeah, will you show a diagram of a transect at some stage? I assume that, Terry, that you mean a map of a typical transect.
I won't be doing that because I don't think there is one. I honestly wouldn't know what a typical transect looked like. They are immensely different. Some are really short, straight line. I know one that's not very far from where I live, which is a straight line down a footpath, and it runs for about a quarter of a mile and takes just over 15 minutes for the guy that walks it with his gammy leg to do. But others go for hours, which I think is a big mistake, and they wind their way through all sorts of bits of the habitat. So I don't think there is such a thing as a standard transect.
No,
And there is
no, sorry, Nick, not a standard transect, a typical transect, just an example.
Yeah, sorry, that's what I meant. I'm sorry, I used the wrong word.
Yeah.
I don't think there is such a thing as a typical transect. They are incredibly varied.
No, but showing an example of one would just be illustrative.
Well,
but if you're not going to do one, that's
well, I haven't got one prepared, so I can't.
Right.
I wouldn't even know where to start to look for it. I guess I'd have to look at the UK BMS website and see if I can pull one off there. But what you're trying to do, this might answer the question. If you know that there is an idea of setting up a transect on a site, you want to go and work out what types of habitats there are there and plan to walk through each of them. If it's a really big site, I would say set up more than one transect, otherwise you'll get exhausted walking through it in the summer. And also, in addition to looking to walk the transect through different sections of different habitats, you want to think about what management will there be in the future, because you might want to walk through sections which all look very similar at the minute, but you know that things are going to change. Perhaps someone's going to put a fence in and start grazing, or cut down a load of trees, and you'll want to see what effect that has. So transects can go anywhere, they can be any length. Ideally, they shouldn't be more than a couple of hours, in my opinion, and I think the best is about 45 minutes to an hour. And they should try to sample all the habitats on a site. Hopefully that's partly answered the question, but I'm afraid I don't have a picture or a map showing a typical transect.
It might be fair to add, Nick, that if you're joining an existing transect as a new recorder, that the transect leader is likely to have a map for that particular transect.
Oh, yes.
So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, they will. They must, because every transect has been mapped on the UK BMS. So you're quite right, Jim. If anyone's joining a transect as a new member of a team, they'll be given a map, or should be given a map. Perhaps they'll just be walked around the site and told this section starts here by this big tree or that gatepost. But there is a map somewhere of every transect that's walked.
There's a question.
Did you say a second question?
Yeah, there's a question from Colin to ask, can you take breaks between sections on a transect, or must you walk immediately onto the next section?
Very good question, Colin. And do you know, I thought about saying something about that when I was talking about recording when you get to the end of the section, and I forgot. So thank you very much. It's almost as if you were listening to me thinking. You can take a break. At the end of a section, you can stop. If you want to have a sit down and a sandwich and a drink, you can. And I was very pleased when I checked with the guy that's in charge of transects in the UK. And I said, if you get to the end of a section, and as you've got to the end, the sun has gone in and you can see that there's a big lump of cloud that's going to be in the way for the next 5 or 10 minutes. Is it okay to wait for it to go past? And he said, yeah, why not? So that's really helpful, I think, because you don't have to just plow on. If there's some reason why it's better to wait before you go on, not for an hour, but if there's some reason to wait 5 minutes before you go on, like taking a break and having a drink, or because the weather conditions are briefly bad, then it is perfectly acceptable. But you shouldn't do a transect walk that takes, let's say, 45 minutes and have an hour's break along the way, because obviously that gives very different sorts of temperatures and amounts of sunlight across that longer period. And should we move on, Jim?
A question from Robert Pell. How do you account for varying ability in new observers? Do you need a year of non-transect observations as a quality assurance step? I guess that's kind of training year.
Yes, well, we do, within the Upper Thames branch, we do always try and pair new people up with experienced walkers so they can go around and get their eye in, as it were. But there isn't actually any specification that you have to have a certain level of competence. And if it's the case that there's nobody else to walk, I think it's better to have someone who's going to go out and possibly make a few mistakes than to have nobody go out at all. It's one of those things where once you start doing it, it actually becomes easier and easier as you go along. A bit like driving a car. I feel a bit like Van Tam now when he's doing his football analogies with the COVID. But anyway, when you learn to drive a car, it seems very complicated at first, and you can't think how on earth people manage to indicate and change gear and look in the rear view mirror and everything all at the same time. But eventually you get so you can do it without thinking. And it's much the same with transects. You don't have to think after a bit about, was it sunny and did I have a shadow? It sort of comes second nature. And the same with identifying the butterflies. Most of what you see on a transect you walk regularly will be the same species you saw the last 3 or 4 years. So it does get easier with practice. That's certainly true.
And Robert goes on to note that the methodology has similarities to the BTO survey squares, for example. And he makes the point that the most useful ones, the ones that are walked for longest, and he asks, what's the oldest established transect in our region, out of interest?
I think they're the ones in Shabbington Woods.
Which
That's
have
my
been running
feeling.
since 1976, I think.
They have. There's Oakley Wood, Shabbington Wood, and at least one other which started in 1976.
Yeah.
And there's some others that started very soon after that. I'm afraid the names escape me.
Yeah.
I can't remember for certain, but 1976 is the date that some of those started. The very earliest in the country were walked in Monkswood in Cambridgeshire by Ernie Pollard, hence the fact that some people call transect walks Pollard walks. Even that wasn't much earlier. That was probably early 1970s, and by 1976 he'd hit upon a method that he handed out to various people, including some of the people who were studying butterflies at Oxford University, and they set up the walks in Burnwood. Okay, I'll move on, shall I, Jim?
Questions for now, Nick. Thank you.
Okay. Well, there was certainly plenty of detail there for people to have to try and remember. So, useful guidance and forms. If after this evening you think, well, that was delivered so quickly, I can't remember half of it, don't panic, because all the information you could possibly want is on the UK BMS site. So if you navigate through a search engine to UK BMS, you will find all sorts of information. For instance, field guidance notes for butterfly transects. There we are, G2. Information about how to monitor the numbers. Guidance for filling in the form. This is for the people setting up the transect, by the way, not for the average walker. Classifications, again, for the person setting up, and so on. And at the bottom here, weekly recording form, which we will be looking at in a minute, and that's the bit that the people running the transect scheme hope you will take with you and fill in. So plenty of information on the UK BMS site, lots of stuff there. So you won't actually need to memorize everything I've said this evening, which is a good thing. Here we are, here's the form. And you can see that what you have to fill in, I'm sorry, I'm going to read it to you, is the site name, the recorder, that's your name, year, date, which might seem a bit daft, does to me, but there you go, year and date. Week number, you don't need to fill that in. If you're a bit of a pedant and you want to put it in, starting next week on the 1st of April, that'll be the first week. And at the end of the season, that on the 30th of September, that will be the 26th week. Start means what time did you begin your walk? Finish, obviously, what time did you finish your walk? It doesn't mean what time did you leave your car and head off to the walk. It means when did you pass the beginning of the section A or section 1? And when did you finish, if you've got 15 sections at the end here? You don't have to have 15 sections. This is just because on some larger sites, there could be as many as 15 sections. I think most sites probably have around 10. You need to know the temperature. It says average. So we're talking about the difference between the beginning when you set off, when remember it's supposed to be 13, and the end, and the average wind speed, because it often does change when you're out walking for a couple of hours, and the direction. Now, some people tell me they do this by getting home and looking on the internet to see what the wind direction for the day was, but I'm not sure that's right, because I know when I walk 2 sites on the same day and do 2 transects, the wind direction can be quite different because of the topography, the hills and the woods, which deflect the wind. So I try and work it out while I'm there by thinking about where's the sun? Well, that's probably south. Which way's the wind coming from? So I don't use what it says on the internet for my region of the UK. I actually work it out on site. You'll notice you've got your sections here. So we walk section 1 and we perhaps see one grizzled skipper if we're lucky, and a brimstone, large white, and a common blue, and we just put the number that we see in section 1. Then at the end, that's at the end of section 1. But before we start section 2, we have to do the sunshine, which is hidden down the bottom of the page. And you are supposed to fill this in for every section. Now, the UK BMS scheme does allow you to simply put in an average. So you could, if for some reason your mind went awry and you didn't think about recording all this, you could cast your mind back when you get to the end and say, oh, it was mostly sunny, let's put 70%. But they don't, the UK BMS don't think that's the best way, and neither do I. Try and record it every section as you go. Far better. Notes, you might want to make a few notes. At the moment, the UK BMS cannot cope with written notes that are added. So if you do add any written notes here, they're for your benefit, really. There is a hope that one day the system will be so clever with so much capacity that it'll be able to take all these notes and store them as well. But the sort of thing you might want to write here is things like section C had been cut. None of the other sections had. This had a big impact on the number of butterflies in section C, that sort of thing. So that you, when you look back at it, it makes sense to you. So let's see if we can remember the key points. See if I can remember the key points. I wrote them down because I knew I'd forget otherwise. We're walking once a week in suitable weather from April to September. We're walking a fixed route. Someone has already determined the route, unless you're just about to start a brand new transect next week. Someone has already determined precisely where you walk at a steady pace without stopping. In the summer, if you're on a good site, I think you will need to stop in a section and write down some of the things you've seen, because if you wait till the end, you'll be thoroughly confused. But that's the ideal. You record the sightings of species which are within an imaginary box, 5 meters high, 5 meters in front, and usually people say 2.5 meters to either side, but if you want, you can do that 5 meters to one side. And you write down only the species that you are absolutely sure about. You do everything that's within your ability to avoid double counting. So you don't count things that come from behind, and you try to avoid counting something exciting that flew past you and settled, and then flew past you again and settled, and so on. You try and avoid that. And as I said, I think at one other point, not a competition to see if you can record more than others. The whole point of transects is to get data to give us numbers of abundance of butterflies in Britain. So we're not so much here interested in precisely which species are on a site. We are interested in that, but we're very, very interested in the numbers of the species that you see, the numbers of individual butterflies of each species, so that we can work out whether they're becoming more abundant or less abundant. And then people can crunch all this data back at UK BMS and CEH, the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and they can say things like, well, look at this. In all the woodlands in Britain, the numbers of a certain species are going down. Why is that? Because they're not going down in grassland, and then people can go out and do a bit of research and see if they can work out why it is. Or conversely, they might say, oh, look at this. The numbers of this species are going up, but only on acid grassland. They're not changing on neutral grassland. I wonder why that is. And they can go out and look into it. So what we're trying to do is walk once a week, suitable weather, a fixed route at a steady pace, recording everything we're absolutely certain of without double counting, to get a really accurate feel for how the numbers of each individual species are changing. And here's just to show you that the field guidance form G2 I mentioned looks like this at the beginning. I'm not really sure why I'm showing you that, just to show that it is there, and it says everything that I've said pretty much. Although I will have said a few things that aren't on there, I think, which I found out by asking over the years when strange things happened. And I thought, oh, what are you supposed to do then? Like the looking to see if your foot casts a shadow. I don't think it says that anywhere there, but I found that very helpful advice. Now, this was something that was raised. Issues with collecting data. Before I go on, Jim, have you got any more questions that seem pertinent about the method?
No, it's quiet at the moment.
Good, good. I'm going so fast, no one has time to type. So due to the vagaries of the British weather, which is a polite way of saying we have rubbish weather in this country very often in the summer, rare to achieve a full set. That doesn't matter. A small number of missing values are automatically estimated. So there is something called an algorithm, which means a clever bit of mathematical software that can look at the data you have collected on the weeks when you could walk and worked out what you might have seen if you've been having perfect weather all summer. So suppose that this was the return for a particular Transect site. These are all the weeks from through the year. Here's the beginning of this person was beginning to walk in. Oh no, they weren't. I'm going to say in March. You can start in March if the weather's wonderful. And they've recorded from April through, and they've got this data. But you can see, look, there are some weeks where they've missed. And it might be that these weeks here in May were really important for certain species. That's when they're at their peak emergence. But they weren't recorded because nobody walked. So here we've got the numbers which were actually recorded. I've made it bigger so you can see. And then, because those missing weeks didn't get walked, the software, first of all, fills them all in with zeros. But then it does a very clever thing. And it says, well, I've forgotten what this species was. It isn't necessarily what it says there. You saw 29 of those, but you missed part of their peak emergence by not walking through bad weather. And therefore, had you had good weather, the estimate is there would actually have been 44 of them on your transect within your little 5x5 meter box in decent weather. And this species, a bit less affected, but there were smaller numbers to begin with. That's gone up. This species, the weeks that you missed are not weeks when we'd have expected to see that anyway, so that stays at 1, and so on. The algorithm compares the data that you have collected with the data collected on other sites in the weeks that you missed and your particular site over the years in previous recorded history. So that's another reason why it's good, as somebody already said, that some sites are walked repeatedly for year after year after year, even decade after decade, because you get some incredibly robust numbers. And you can be fairly sure, and they've done a lot of testing on this algorithm to make sure that it is pretty accurate, that if they say that the numbers of some species have gone up, like this one here nearly doubled, come back mouse, there it is, from 4 to 7, then that's an accurate reflection of what probably would have happened if we'd had decent weather to go out and walk. So they're saying there were 7 butterflies there in that period, but they probably weren't moving about much, and there was no one there to record them. I just noticed above it 30 went to 65. But anyway, that's what happens behind the scenes. So at the end of the year, every transect records the actual numbers recorded and an estimate of what might have been recorded if all the weeks were walked. Obviously, if all the weeks are walked, then you don't need to have this algorithm coming in to make the numbers better. But very few people, or very few transects, perhaps I should say, managed to secure all 26 weeks with good data. Now, the question was asked, wasn't it, a little while ago, about what if the weather's bad? Should you go? Well, if you know the weather's going to be bad for 3 weeks, let me just go back a bit. So here they had 2 weeks where they missed. Suppose that nobody went in those 2 weeks, and then nobody went in this week, and there were 3 weeks with no data. The algorithm would throw its hands up and say, I'm sorry, I can't work anything out, because there's such a big gap between you seeing almost nothing here and then a whole load of stuff here when the weather was much better. I can't guess what happened in the middle. So it doesn't hurt to miss 1 week here and there. There's 1 week missed and there's another one, but it does make a huge difference to miss 3. So if looking at a long range weather forecast, it looks likely or possible that you're going to miss 3 weeks, it is better to walk it at 12 degrees C than it is to not walk it. As long as you record faithfully what the conditions are that you walked under. So if it was only 12 degrees C, you put that down. The algorithm will obviously pick that up and it will see, this person walked it even though conditions weren't good. We can do something with that because we know what the conditions were. But if you have a long range weather forecast that says it's just a blip and there will be much better weather next week, then I would say don't go out when the weather's dreadful, because it's just depressing to walk around and see nothing. It doesn't make you feel any better, and it doesn't really help the figures because the algorithm will have to kick in anyway if you've got pretty poor weather. So you may as well let the algorithm do it without you going out and risking getting wet and cold. Let's move on. So the UK monitoring scheme, the UK butterfly monitoring scheme, produces lots of reports. There isn't an annual report. Well, actually there is probably. I should think Jim knows more about this than me, but there probably is an annual report for 2020, but it hasn't hit the streets yet, because on Saturday coming, there is a talk, well, it'll be an online talk of the national recorders of butterflies. Richard Fox will be leading that, I imagine, and he'll be revealing the data from the 2020 scheme. So all the numbers have been collected and crunched, and the report is due to hit the streets this weekend. Jim, can you interrupt me for a little while and just say, do you know when we're likely to see that popping up in our inboxes?
I have no inside information on it, but it's usually a week or 2 after the annual meeting, before it actually appears on the website.
Mid-April. Yeah, by mid-April. But it will be, I'm sure, if it isn't absolutely finished, it'll be very close to being finished.
Yeah.
And the data from all of these collected together, along with data from other schemes, goes into these approximately 5-year state of butterflies reports. So we're due another one of these as well, but the data for 2020 is still being crunched, or at least polished, ready to go into both the annual report for 2020 and a state of butterflies report. So all that data that people collect is really useful. And these reports go to everyone you can imagine that might have an influence on the countryside, and not least to people at DEFRA, the government body that makes decisions about agri-environmental schemes and which schemes to put money into and which ones perhaps to knock on the head because they're not producing much in the way of return. So it's really crucial data, and it makes a huge difference to conservation. Okay, now within the UTB, I have no idea. I probably should know how many transects we've got. Hang on a minute, Jim, I'll just do this bit now I've started. These particular places are some of the few transects which have been walked for a while, some of them for a very long time, and they're struggling. They need another person to join in because somebody has left, as obviously will happen from time to time, and they need someone extra. So there's one Castle Meadow at Wallingford, Abbey Fish Ponds and Thrupp Lake are both by Abingdon. Brill Common, not surprisingly, is at Brill, which you might not know, so it's near Bicester. Mowbray Fields is just outside Didcot. Aston Rowant is on the M40 as you go past Stokenchurch. Crowmarsh and Howbury are both near Wallingford. And then Hewenden and West Wickham are both part of the Hewenden estate. although West Wickham is, not surprisingly, just outside Wickham. So those could do with some help. If anyone listening in thinks, well, I live quite close to there, if it just means walking for a few weeks in the year, which is what it will do, it won't mean walking every week. They just want someone to fill in a bit so that when people are not available, somebody else can take over. Jim, you had a question.
Yeah, one of our audience tonight, Tricia, has said that their team can't start until May. How will the algorithm work, as they'll have missed the first part of the season?
I think the answer is it probably won't try to work out what happened in April if you miss 4 weeks. I don't know is the strict answer. I have no idea because I'm not involved in that side of things, but I would imagine that's too big a gap. And the estimates of some species will return, and I've forgotten, there is a technical word that is used, but it basically says does not compute. And it just won't give you an estimated number for that species for the year. So some very early species that fly then and don't fly later, the orange tip might be affected, because perhaps this year there'll be lots of orange tips in April and fewer later, so it won't even try. Sorry, Trish, but I think it just means that this year, some of your species, but not many, because most species do fly after April, some of your species might be affected and end up with no estimated number. Shall I carry on?
It might be worth adding your previous point, Nick, that there are about 50 or 60 transects in the UK BMS from our region, from our 3 counties.
Yes, there's more all the time because people continually set them up, which is a good thing, a very good thing. But as was already said, one of the most important things is to keep the ones that have been going for a long time fully staffed so that they continue, because it's that long data set which is far better than some of the newer things, which you can't really compare what's happened in the first year of a transect with anything, because it is the first year, whereas the ones that have been going for decades, it's really helpful information. But you're quite right, Jim. I know there's about 60, but I'm afraid I didn't think to ask Mark Chapman, who organizes all this, what the absolute number was. He did give me this data, and he told me about one other site as well, which I've now forgotten. Began with an L, but there's, in addition to these, there's one other transect who were in touch with him yesterday to say they could use a help from someone for 2 weeks.
Now, there's a question from Colin, Nick, on that last slide to say, do you contact the organisation shown in the comment column if you want to help with a high priority request? So in your previous slide, you had that column on the right, comment.
No, the person to contact, and I might have been incredibly stupid and not put this on anywhere, is Mark Chapman. Can you find his address, email for us, please, Jim, and stick it into the chat?
Yes.
Thanks very much. Yes, I should have put that on, shouldn't I? What a wally. Mark Chapman's the guy to talk to, because he matches up people who are offering their services with the transects that need them.
Yeah.
Now, it just so happens, by a weird coincidence, that almost every one of those transects that needs help is in Oxfordshire. It is just a coincidence. There were 2 near Wickham, so they're just off the map. But here we have Brill Common, which is northeast of Oxford, look. Aston Rowan, where there are 2 different transects, and they'd like one person to lend a hand. Well, perhaps I suppose 2 people could, but one person perhaps doing a week on either one. And then around Abingdon, the Fish Pond and Thrupp Lake, Little Whittenham, which I didn't mention, they don't actually need someone apart from, in the middle of summer, there are so many butterflies that the one person who walks it that week can't count, and they'd like someone to go along and help by counting maybe the meadow browns while they struggle with the skippers. And down here, the ones near Crowmarsh and Wallingford area. So most of these that need help are in this section of Oxford, which is very strange, but there you are. Last year it was up here we couldn't get people, but this year it's down here. And over in north of Buckingham we had some gaps last year.
Carla thinks Brill might be in Bucks, but is Brill common in Bucks or Oxfordshire?
Well,
it's on the borders, I think.
I think Brill's in Bucks too.
Yes.
And I wonder if I was given a map with a slightly dodgy spot. So it may be that I've put this here and it should be there. But you get the idea, it's roughly there. Brill itself is definitely in Bucks, but I don't know where Brill Common is, to be sure. I think it's the area around the windmill.
Yes, I think so.
So it's near Rushbeds Wood. Anyway, Brill's definitely in Bucks, just over the border. Because I think Borstal is about there. And then, of course, this is Burnwood. Anyway, let's move on. So thanks for that. Yes, I think you're right. It's my fault. I think I've coloured the wrong spot red. Wider countryside. So we've just talked about the Transect survey method and how you have to do it by following a certain set of guidelines in order that all the data is comparable. And the wider countryside, or WCBS, is based on precisely the same type of walking methodology, and it ties in, as somebody already said, with the BTO's breeding bird survey. And in this case, the length of the survey route is predetermined at 2 kilometers. You walk away from your starting point 1 kilometer, and then you come back to your starting point 1 kilometer. Now, if you wish to, you can walk a bit. When you get to the end of the first kilometer, you can walk a bit to the left or the right before you come back, doesn't matter. But all this is going on inside a single 1 kilometer square. And each of your 1 km transects is split into 5 sections. And they are approximately equal length. But because you need to have a precise marker that shows you where a section begins and where it ends, sometimes some of them might be a bit longer because it's easier to go all the way to the fence post or all the way to the gate or all the way to where a path comes off at a side than it is to say, well, I've reached the end of 200 meters, so I'm calling that the end of the section in the middle of this ploughed field where there's no marker and nobody will ever know where it is. So they are supposed to be approximately equal sections, but they in reality often work out to be slightly different. The beauty of this scheme, not that last bit that I was waffling about, the beauty of the WCBS scheme is that it gives us data from every conceivable type of habitat in the UK. Unfortunately, the transects that we just talked about previously tend to be, pretty much all of them, situated in places where people see good numbers and a wide range of species. And the reason that people set them up is that they've got some decent habitat and they want to record what's going on in it, which is absolutely fine, but gives a slightly skewed idea as to how Britain's butterflies are faring. Because we all know that if you're on a train or a passenger in a car looking out the window on any journey, most of the way you see almost no butterflies at all. And occasionally you come through a sort of a hotspot where there might be a cluster of things. And transects tend to go to those hotspots. The wider countryside survey is intended to go to all sorts of places, including places where you don't see so much. So they give a far more accurate reflection of what the UK is like as a whole, rather than just the best bits. So we're using exactly the same pollard walk or transect method, 5 meter box and all the rest of it. One of the beauties of this WCBS scheme is that you only have to walk it 2 weeks of the year. That's 2 visits in 2 separate weeks. You can go more often. You can go as often as you like, but you must go in July and August. You could go twice, I suppose, in August, but it'd be better to go once in July and once in August if that's all you're going to do. But it's a better idea to go more often. But if you've got a rather godforsaken square that you're walking through, you might not want to go too often because you won't see much anyway. But it does give a far better picture of what's going on in the average British countryside and town, because some of these WCBS schemes are on the edges of towns as well. Just like with the Transects, there's masses of information on the UK BMS site. So you've got the guidance here, look, and the stuff about the Pollard Walk still, because it's used in the WCBS. And if you look at this little map, you can see our area, which is here, that white block. This map is from a couple of years ago, and I'm afraid our performance might have slumped because last year we didn't do very well because of COVID. Quite a few squares that we have in our area that normally get walked didn't. However, that may well be true for other areas. I wouldn't know. When the 2020 report comes out, we'll find out. But we had what was referred to as good coverage. However, I know that of the 50 squares in our area, only 28 were walked. So that's not really very good, is it? And I'm hoping that there might be more people prepared to go out and walk a couple of weeks in some of these squares. So where are they? I hear you clamoring. How do I get involved? Here we are, look. Milton Keynes and Bletchley, across through Buckingham. Some of these, of course, are adopted and people are walking them, but others around the 3 counties are currently unadopted. That is to say, they have nobody walking them, not even for 2 weeks. And here's where they are, the ones which are either not walked, in which case there is no name, and the ones which are walked do have a name. So the ones where we need people are up here where I can't read it because it says you are screen sharing. Are you able to see that, Jim? What's that top one? Is it Filkins? I seem to recall.
Carterton, yes.
Yeah. And then Shipton at Shipton under Wychwood, the Wychwood Way, which isn't all that far. Padbury, Finemere. This one, it surprises me, between Finemere Wood and Bruntswood. That's really quite a nice bit of countryside. I'm surprised no one does that. Salden Wood near Newton Longville. I've got an offer from Tim to do that, which he contacted me last week. So thanks, Tim. Emerson Valley in the MK and the South Lawton Valley in the MK. And then also Horton Wharf near Cheddington in Bucks. Southend near Turville in Bucks. Again, I would have thought a very nice place, but I don't know it. It might be some reason you can't get on there. It might be very private and you can't get in. And Tatling End near Gerrard's Cross, which I do know goes through an area with things like scrap metal yards and a bit of a motorway across it too. So it's not especially aesthetic, that one. Just like with the transects, there's plenty of feedback to the people who take part. So there will be very soon, probably just like we were talking about with the transect, in about another 2 or 3 weeks, you'll be receiving, if you walk the wider countryside butterfly survey. If you're registered with them, you'll get their annual newsletter telling you what happened in 2020. And you can always go online at the UK BMS to look at all the data that's been collected from all sorts of things. So as you see, you can get the official UK statistics, which will be updated within just over perhaps 10 days. You can look for individual species and see how they're doing across time and across regions of the UK. And you can look at all the various sites. Unless you're given some special administrative, if only I could say that, rights, you can't see a great deal of detail about these sites, but you can at least find out where they are. And the reports go here as well, so that you can click on the reports. So once again, this is a really important scheme, collecting data so that we can use butterflies as indicators telling us about the health of not just butterfly populations, but invertebrates in general. And of course, because invertebrates feed mammals and birds, the health of mammals and bird populations too. I mean, it's, to me, no surprise that many birds that eat insects are in continually lowering numbers, that they're continually falling, perhaps that's better, because there just aren't the insects there to feed them anymore. So unfortunately, they're suffering. Right, there may be some questions. So I thought we'd take a short break and we'll see if Jim has any questions.
I've been dealing with one or two questions just over the chat line myself. So
thank you. Did you find Mark Chapman's email for us?
Yes, that's gone out.
Thank you.
One of our audience is in Edinburgh, so I've pointed her towards the East of Scotland branch website, which has got information about contacts for recording there.
Yes, we wouldn't want their carbon footprint of them coming down here to walk our wider countryside butterfly survey. Thank you very much if you were thinking of it, but best to stay up there, I think.
I think Victoria is hopefully planning to do a transect in somewhere in the Edinburgh area.
Yep, far more sensible.
Yes.
I mean, I would say that actually to people who are listening to this who live in the Upper Thames branch. It might be a bit of a lure to think, oh, I'll go to the Aston Rowan Nature Reserve. I heard they've got something like 32 species there. But if there's somewhere closer to you that could use help, that perhaps is more sensible, because one of the things about walking a transect, which is sadly predictable to those of us who do walk them, you can be at home, you look outside, it's beautifully sunny. You think, well, it's only 10 o'clock. I can't start the walk till 10:45. So I'll busy myself for 15 minutes. And at about 10:15, I'll get in the car and drive over to walk my walk. And you get to your car at 10:15 and something's happened to the sky and it's completely clouded over. The further you drive, the further you travel to go to a transect, the more likely it is that the weather will be different there when you arrive compared with what it looked like when you're at home. So it's best to do it locally.
Suzanne McInnes is from Edinburgh, but lives in Reading, and is asking, is there anything near to her in Reading? She'd love to help.
Off the top of my head, I can't answer that question because unfortunately I don't live in Reading, but I bet there is. I mean, I just don't know.
If you go back,
again, Mark Chapman is the man to ask. You pop an email to Mark.
Yes.
He will tell you which are the closest transects, which ones are hoping that somebody will show an interest and walk around with the existing walkers. And he might know of one that isn't very far away that actually is crying out for people. I would have thought those around Crowmarsh were not all that far from Reading, but I suppose it depends which side of Reading you live. If you live in Caversham, it's not very far, but if you live to the southwest, it's a long way round.
We've got one.
Okay, I expect everybody's worked out.
Yes, we've got one at Lidsdown near Aston Upthorpe, which could do with one or two more people. So that's near West
Reading. That's not all that far.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there are definitely places that people can help without any question at all.
Yeah.
Okay, I expect people spotted the butterflies were on the left here. If anyone failed that, then I think perhaps time to reconsider coming out to do some butterfly ID with us. And you might have worked out that there are 3 butterflies all the way across here, but there's only 2 ladybirds at the bottom. So the butterflies win. Hooray! Predictable. Butterflies were bound to win, weren't they? Okay, we're into the last leg, folks. You've done very well to stick with it this far, and I hope that your brains haven't turned to mush. We're trying to remember all that. Reduced effort surveys. So this is actually still perhaps quite as much effort on the day, but it's for less time in the year normally. And it's usually about walking and looking for a single species as opposed to trying to count everything you see. And it's usually just when the adults are flying, but not always. So you're going to use the same methodology as it says. So you still try to walk a fairly fixed route with a fairly fixed, steady pace, and you record within your box so that you get numbers that you can compare year after year. But You're not trying to count every single thing that you see. And in some cases, we look for the adults, and in some we look for other life stages. There's guidance for this on the website as well, on the UK BMS website. You can see stuff here. So timed count, this is for adults. Mars fritillary larval web. Now that unfortunately isn't much help to us because we haven't got any Mars fritillaries in our area, but you could adapt it to other larvae, and we are doing surveys, as we'll see in a minute, a picture of a striped lichnous caterpillar, and there is now guidance for that too, but it's not on the UK BMS, that's with BC. So I thought I'd start with an egg. It seemed a reasonable place to start. In 2020, it didn't happen, but usually we go out and we do egg surveys. So teams of people go to sites that we've been to traditionally over the last probably 15 years, and we count the number of brown hairstreak eggs that you can find in a certain length of hedge, and we compare the numbers to make a decision about whether the brown hairstreak is doing better or worse year on year. And that's quite good fun. And it's a time of year in the winter when all the leaves have gone so that you can find the eggs more easily, when there's not a lot else to do if you're a butterfly lover, because bird watchers, they're fine. They've got all the winter birds, but there aren't all that many winter butterflies. You might want to look for caterpillars, and we do look for caterpillars of several species, but the one which is really quite striking is this one, the striped lichnous. And again, there's now a new standardized technique, which is going to include counting how many flower spikes. You can see here this plant's probably got something in the region of 6 or 7 flower spikes, and how many larvae on each of the spikes, and then how many plants there are in the field, and so on. And very importantly, our area possibly has the greatest number of striped lichnous, a rare moth in the UK. We've certainly got at least 40%. We think there might well be populations of this caterpillar in Berkshire, where people haven't really looked for it because it wasn't known to be there. But 1 or 2 expeditions looking for other things have come across it, and people are starting to say, wow, hey, it looks like it could be not just all the way across Bucks and bits of South Oxfordshire, but also in Berkshire, in which case we will have more than half the UK population. We look for pupa too, of the black hairstreak, the only species as far as I'm aware where we search for the pupa, because it is actually perhaps the most conspicuous stage. This is one, the black hairstreak, which can be a real sod, excuse me, to find when it's an adult, because it'll sit at the top of a blackthorn bush and won't move for 2 hours, and it's really tricky to spot it up there. The pupa are laid on the top of leaves at around about head height. Once you've got your eye in for this beautiful little shape pretending to be a bird dropping, they can be fairly easy to find at certain sites. We've gone out on occasions, as you see here, with step ladders and other types of methods of looking at the tops of the blackthorn, but we found it's actually easier just to walk around and find the pupa, which seem to be more likely to be on the sunny side of the bush, on top of a leaf or sometimes a twig, and around about head height. So that's a good way of monitoring black hairstreak. The wood white, now we look for this as an adult, and we're looking for it especially in North Bucks, where it does seem, I'm hopeful that I'm not being too optimistic here, but it does seem to be spreading slightly into North Bucks from Northants. We've had more reports recently of it on the border and just into Bucks than we had for several years, but that might be down to the fact that we have some Nick Board, the species champion, who's getting some surveys organised up there. We also search for the adult drab looper. This picture is one taken by Peter Cuss, so give him the credit for that. This is a particularly wonderful site, which actually, sadly, is in Hampshire, not one of ours, but woodlands in Berkshire with this plant, wood spurge, the same plant the moth is feeding from. Fairly sunny rides, and there are some fairly wide rides in the parts of West Berkshire where this butterfly is found, with this plant are important, and we're going to send teams out surveying for both the adult, which is a day flying moth, and the plant. because if we can find a plant, fairly likely we can find the moth as well. And then finally, in terms of different types of surveys, here's something else you could join in with. If you live within the Upper Thames area, sorry people in Edinburgh, this isn't for you, but if you live within the Upper Thames area and you felt that you would like, for instance, to do some recording, let's say here on the Oxford-Berkshire border, you could let a lady called Jan Hasler know, and she would send you all the data that's been recorded in this 10 kilometre square. So this box is 10 by 10, 10 kilometres by 10 kilometres. And you would find out where the majority of butterflies are seen in that square. But the idea is not to go to those spots. The idea is to visit the perhaps 4 spots, 4 2 kilometre squares, that 25 of them make up this 10 by 10 square. Visit 2 or 3, perhaps 4 or 5 squares in here where there are very few records, because there are probably nearly as many, if not as many, butterflies in those bits as there are in the rest of the square. It's just that no one who lives in the area where there's been no records has sent a record in. It's very often under-recorded rather than underpopulated with butterflies. And indeed, 2 years back, someone took on a 10k square which had few records of anything much, and within his first year he turned up 4 squares with small blue which were completely unknown, but it was purely that no one had looked. He looked hard, but no one had looked, so things weren't being uncovered. So it's a way to find out what's in the area where you live. If you live in one of these squares that's blue, if you live in one of the squares that's yellow, someone is already looking, but they could do with some help because they can't get to all the squares that need looking at. So that's something you might like to do. Even if you would like to help in the bits that are pink, it's very likely that the people who are species champions would accept some help. I can't imagine most sensible people would say no to some help. So if you're interested to find out what's there, you'd get an annual report of what was seen in the previous year, and that annual report normally comes out about now. So it gives you a good clue as to which bits are under-recorded and what has been recorded around where you live. So just going back through what these schemes are about. The transect is 26 weeks, although quite often there's a team of people, so not one person walking every 26 weeks, at fixed times with standardized conditions. The WCBS is really similar, but it's usually for just a few weeks of the year. I don't think anyone walks a WCBS square 26 weeks of the year. They walk less frequently, and they're much shorter by and large, at only 2 kilometres. There is, as it says here, a very similar scheme walked by members of the BTO. They use very slightly different rules, but the results are entirely comparable. And then 2 other sorts of survey that you might like to get involved in: the reduced effort, where you go out and look for a single life stage for just a few weeks of the year normally, or a 10k square where it's based around your home and you might like to know what flies around you and help to fill in the empty squares. So for a change here, I have actually remembered to give you somebody's email address, Jan Hasler's email address there at the bottom, if you're interested in finding out what lives near you and helping the 10k square champion in that area get better records, or possibly even taking on a 10k square. Pretty much all the information about all our surveys will be here on the Butterfly Conservation Upper Thames Branch website. So you can search for it fairly easily by just searching Upper Thames Branch BC, which most search engines will bring you straight here. And all the information will be found by the drop downs, principally on the conservation, but some of the various bits of information we've been talking about today might be found under butterflies and moths as well. I'm just going to mention, probably don't need to, I did a whole session on this last week, but one of the best ways of recording is through iRecord. There is a dedicated app for butterflies, but you can record everything, pretty much everything you see, from plant right through to mammal, on iRecord. You can get it on your phone, you can get it on your PC, your laptop, your tablet, and it's completely free, downloadable from all the usual stores. But the best one for recording butterflies, and I'm just going to come back to something I perhaps might have said when we were talking about transects, and that single purple emperor, the first one you've ever seen at a particular site, flies from behind you and you're spitting blood because you're desperate to record that on your transect form, and you're trying to work out how can you pretend that it actually flew from the side and not from behind you, or hope that it's going to turn around and come back so you can say, yes, I did see it within the transect. Don't worry. Don't put it on the transect form. Don't deliberately count something from behind, but stick it on iRecord butterflies instead, because all these records go through to exactly the same place in the end, all go into the same databases and get crunched in the same way to feed information through to our butterflies as indicators, feedback that we give to everybody. So if you see something and you can't add it, if perhaps it's outside your 5-meter wide box, then you can stick it on iRecord butterflies. Perfectly acceptable to do that. This is true for moths as well as it is for butterflies. Plenty of ways to record the moths you see. You can record moths if you're walking a transect, and I assume you can. I haven't walked a WCBS, so I haven't actually looked in detail at whether they can record moths, but I would imagine you could make notes and record moths on that too. You can definitely record moths by other methods, and we went through this last week, all on the Upper Thames Branch website. One thing about moths, which is to me just a little bit strange, is that the map looks different. Buckinghamshire is similar, that's here on the west, VC24. That's about the same shape as you'd expect, but Milton Keynes is part of Bucks in this map, and so is Slough, and right down towards the south here, a bit further south than you would expect. Berkshire comes up right past Oxford and occupies a whole lot of land that on a modern map would be in Oxford. So Oxford is smaller, VC23. So moths are recorded on this system. It doesn't much matter. If you sent your records to the wrong moth officer, they would soon ping them over to the right one. But it would be a good thing if you know this, to send your moth records to the right person in the first place. And as I've said repeatedly, there is loads of information about all this. I don't think anyone would be expected to remember everything I've said. So you can find pretty much everything I have said, get away, on the UK BMS website. You can find information about the wider butterfly seam as well as the transects. You can find out about all the information that you've put in. You can get your own reports back. Stuff that goes through from the Joint Nature Conservation Committee to DEFRA and the government. That's all in there. You can see what we as an organisation, along with plenty of other organisations like Bug Life and Plant Life and the RSPB and the Wildlife Trust, what we've sent through to government in terms of what needs action because things are not going so well. And then there's one or two other helpful bits of information here. This slide should be available to look at in the recording, but in addition, you can find all this stuff on our own Upper Thames Branch website. So thank you very much for your interest, and I'm going to finish with a picture that we nearly finished with last week, which is, it's supposed to be fun, you know. I really enjoy going out and doing my transects, and it sounds like a lot to remember, but when you're out there in the sun seeing all those butterflies, I think you can't really beat it. A great way to spend a day. So thanks very much. And we'll see if anyone has a question.
There was a question from Duncan. Does it matter if one of the 10-kilometre squares is half in Hampshire? Are we only looking for the bit in Berkshire to be surveyed? And I've answered that to say, yes, we're looking at the parts of the 10-kilometre square that overlap with Berkshire. because Hampshire recorders will be doing similar from the Hampshire
Yes.
direction.
Although I'm absolutely sure that if you were to stray into Hampshire and tell them what you've seen, they'd be grateful.
Yes, indeed.
So we wouldn't ever say to anyone, you mustn't go over the border, but we'd like you to concentrate on the under-recorded parts of our own 3 counties first, please.
Yeah.
I've got a great ability to mesmerize my audience so that nobody dares ask a question. Well, I don't want to keep people unnecessarily.
That's okay. Well, I shall stop recording now.
Okay, thank you very much, Carla.
That's all right.